The dust-laden wind carried the distant echoes of gunshots as Rosalie Turner clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, quickening her pace through the unpaved streets of Linden, Montana. It was 1876, and the small frontier town had seen its fair share of violence since the gold rush brought prospectors, gamblers, and outlaws alike to this stretch of the Montana Territory. But for Rosalie, the real dangers had never come from strangers with 6 shooters. They had come from the man who had once vowed to love and protect her. Rosalie's green eyes darted nervously as she approached the general store, her long auburn hair partially concealed beneath a modest bonnet. At 24, she carried herself with the weariness of someone much older, the ghosts of her past etched into every careful movement. 2 years had passed since she'd fled her husband's ranch in Colorado, 2 years of looking over her shoulder, waiting for him to find her. "Miss Turner," Mr. Hopkins, the storekeeper, greeted her with a kind smile. "Your usual supplies today?" "Yes, please," she answered softly, placing a small list on the counter. "And if you have any of those peppermint candies, I'd like a few." As Mr. Hopkins gathered her items, the store's bell jingled, announcing a new customer. Instinctively, Rosalie tensed, her body remembering pain before her mind could rationalize that her husband wouldn't simply stroll into the store after all this time. "Afternoon, Mr. Hopkins." "Madam," came a deep, gentle voice that belonged to a tall man with broad shoulders and kind hazel eyes. Rosalie recognized him immediately. Daniel Armstrong, one of the most respected ranchers in the county. Unlike many who'd come seeking fortune in gold or silver, Armstrong had built his success through honest work and fair dealings. "Mr. Armstrong, what brings you into town? Thought you'd be busy with that new herd," Hopkins said cheerfully. "Need supplies for the ranch. Got 5 new hands and they eat like they've been starving for months." His eyes crinkled when he smiled, and Rosalie noticed the sun-worn lines around them, the mark of a man who spent his days outdoors. Daniel's gaze drifted to Rosalie, and he tipped his hat politely. "Miss Turner, isn't it? You teach at the schoolhouse." Surprised that he knew who she was, Rosalie nodded. "Yes, for almost a year now. My foreman's boy Tommy speaks highly of you, says you don't yell like the previous teacher even when the boys put a snake in your desk." Despite herself, Rosalie smiled. "The snake was more frightened than I was. Besides, I grew up with 3 brothers. It takes more than a garden snake to scare me." The lie came easily. There were many things that frightened Rosalie Turner, but she'd become adept at hiding her fears behind a carefully constructed facade of calm. Well, it impressed the boy, might have even convinced him that reading has some merits. Daniel leaned against the counter, his manner relaxed but respectful. As Rosalie gathered her purchases, their conversation flowed surprisingly easily. When she mentioned needing to repair the roof of her small rented cabin before winter, Daniel offered to send one of his men to help. "Oh, I couldn't impose," she said quickly. "It's no imposition. Can't have our school teacher getting soaked when the snow melts." His tone was matter-of-fact, with no hint of ulterior motive. Rosalie hesitated. Since arriving in Linden, she'd been careful to maintain her independence, to avoid owing anyone anything. Debts created bonds, and bonds created vulnerabilities. But winter in Montana was harsh, and her meager teacher's salary barely covered necessities. "That's very kind," she finally said. "Thank you." As she left the store, Rosalie couldn't help but feel Daniel Armstrong's eyes following her. Not in the predatory way she'd grown to recognize and fear, but with something that felt almost like concern. The following Saturday, true to his word, Daniel arrived at her small cabin on the outskirts of town with 2 of his ranch hands. To Rosalie's surprise, Instead of merely supervising, Daniel himself climbed onto the roof, working alongside his men to replace the damaged shingles. By midday, the autumn sun had warmed the air enough for the men to remove their coats. From where she stood preparing coffee and sandwiches for them, Rosalie could see Daniel's strong arms and broad back as he worked, his movements confident and precise. "Miss Turner, got any more nails?" he called down. She brought out a small tin. "These are all I have. Should be enough to finish." He reached down to take them, and their fingers brushed momentarily. Rosalie jerked back as if burned, the tin clattering to the ground. "I'm sorry," she stammered, color rising to her cheeks as she bent to retrieve the scattered nails. Daniel's expression shifted to one of gentle understanding. "No harm done," he said quietly, descending the ladder to help her. As they worked side by side gathering the nails, he asked, "You been in Linden long enough to call it home?" She replied vaguely. "It's a good town. Getting more civilized every year." His voice was casual, but his eyes were observant. "Sheriff Miller keeps the peace pretty well." Rosalie nodded, wondering if he was trying to reassure her that she was safe here. Had her fear been that obvious, by late afternoon, the roof was repaired. Daniel refused her offer of payment, suggesting instead that perhaps she might consider giving Tommy extra help with his reading. "Boy's smart, just needs someone to believe in him." As the men prepared to leave, Daniel lingered. "There's a harvest social at the church next weekend," he said, his hat in his hands. "Whole town will be there, good food, some music." Rosalie busied herself straightening her apron. "I've heard about it. Thought maybe you'd like to go with me." The directness of his invitation took her by surprise. "Mr. Armstrong, Daniel," he corrected gently. "And it's just a social, Miss Turner, in a church full of people. Nothing improper about that." His words were deliberately chosen, she realized. He was making it clear that he respected her reputation, that his intentions were honorable. "I'll consider it," she said finally. His smile was warm. "That's all I ask." After he left, Rosalie sat alone on her small porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Daniel Armstrong was nothing like her husband, nothing like any man she'd known, really. His kindness seemed genuine, his strength tempered by gentleness. But Rosalie knew better than to trust appearances. Frank Turner had been charming too in the beginning, before the drinking, before the rages, before the first time he'd raised his hand to her, and all the times that followed. She unconsciously touched her side, where beneath her dress lay one of the many scars that mapped the geography of her marriage. No, she couldn't risk it. Not again. Not ever. Yet when Saturday came, Rosalie found herself putting on her best dress, a modest blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She told herself she was only going because it would look strange if the schoolteacher didn't attend a community event. It had nothing to do with Daniel Armstrong. The church was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, lanterns casting a warm glow over the gathered townspeople. Children ran between tables laden with food, while musicians tuned their instruments in the corner. Daniel found her almost immediately, as if he'd been watching for her arrival. "You came," he said, pleasure evident in his voice. "It seemed rude to decline when the entire town is here," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. His smile suggested he didn't believe her, but he didn't press. Instead, he offered her a cup of cider and introduced her to people she hadn't yet met in her year in Linden. Throughout the evening he stayed near, not hovering but present, making sure she was comfortable, included in conversations. When the music started, he asked her to dance. Rosalie hesitated, but the music was lively, the atmosphere festive, and somehow saying no seemed harder than agreeing. His hand was warm at her waist, respectfully placed, but the proximity was enough to make her heart race with a mixture of anxiety and something else she didn't want to name. "You're a fine dancer, Miss Turner," he said as they moved through the steps of a Virginia reel. "My mother insisted all her children learn, said it was civilized." "Was your family from back east?" She nodded. "Boston, originally." "My father was a professor before he decided to seek adventure in Colorado." "And did he find it?" A shadow crossed her face. "Too much of it, perhaps. He and my mother died of fever when I was 17. Daniel's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry." "My own parents passed when I was young as well. Leaves a hole nothing quite fills." The understanding in his voice touched her unexpectedly. When the dance ended, he led her outside for some air, the night cool and clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, looking upward. "That's why I stayed when so many moved on looking for gold or better opportunities. Something about this land speaks to me." Rosalie wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's very different from Boston or even Denver." "You lived in Denver." She realized her slip. "For a time." Daniel seemed to sense her reluctance to elaborate. Instead, he pointed out constellations, sharing stories his grandfather had told him about the stars. His voice was soothing, and despite her wariness, Rosalie found herself relaxing in his company. Over the following weeks, Daniel found reasons to visit town more frequently than a busy rancher normally would. He'd stop by the schoolhouse after classes with books he thought she might enjoy, or to ask her advice about starting a small library for the town. Sometimes he brought small gifts, wildflowers, a jar of honey from his hives, once a beautiful hand-carved wooden box he claimed was just gathering dust at his ranch. Each time, he was respectful of her boundaries, never pressing for more than she seemed willing to give. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rosalie found her defenses weakening. On a crisp November afternoon, Daniel invited her to ride out to his ranch. "My sister's visiting from Helena with her children," he explained. "Thought you might enjoy some female company. And Emily's been curious about the teacher her nieces and nephews talk about so much." The presence of his family made the invitation seem safe, and Rosalie agreed. Daniel's ranch was impressive, a sprawling property with a handsome main house, bunkhouses for the workers, barns and corrals filled with quality horses. Unlike some ranchers who flaunted their wealth, Daniel's home was comfortable rather than ostentatious, built for practicality and warmth. Emily Armstrong Walker proved to be as kind as her brother, welcoming Rosalie with genuine warmth. "Daniel speaks of you constantly," she confided when they had a moment alone. "I haven't seen him this interested in a woman since Catherine." "Catherine?" Rosalie couldn't help asking. Emily's expression grew somber. "His wife. She died in childbirth 7 years ago along with their son. It nearly broke him." She studied Rosalie's face. "He hasn't told you?" "No," Rosalie said quietly. "We don't speak of personal matters much. That's my brother. Carries his burden silently." Emily squeezed her hand. "But he's a good man, Rosalie. The best I know." The revelation shifted something in Rosalie's understanding of Daniel. His kindness, his patience, they came from someone who understood loss, who had experienced his own kind of pain. That evening, as Daniel drove her back to town in his buggy, Rosalie felt a new awareness between them. The air seemed charged with unspoken words. "Your sister is lovely," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "And your ranch is beautiful. Too quiet, though." "A place like that needs a family to fill it." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "Emily told you about Catherine." It wasn't a question, but Rosalie answered anyway. "Yes, I'm sorry for your loss." His hands tightened briefly on the reins. "It was a long time ago. Some wounds don't heal with time." Daniel looked at her then, really looked, his eyes searching hers. No, they don't, but eventually you learn to live with them. When they reached her cabin, he helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment they stood close, the lantern on her porch casting long shadows. "Rosalie," he said softly. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sounded different in his voice, like something precious. "I'd like to call on you, properly." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Daniel, you don't have to answer now, just think about it." Before she could respond, he brushed his lips against her cheek, so gently she might have imagined it, then returned to his buggy. That night, Rosalie lay awake, her thoughts in turmoil. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one with love and companionship, with Daniel's strong, gentle presence beside her. But then, unbidden, memories of Frank flooded back, his jealous rages, his cruel words, the bruises he left on her skin and her spirit. No, she couldn't risk it. Even if Daniel seemed different, even if everything in her wanted to believe he was the man he appeared to be. The stakes were too high. December brought heavy snowfall, transforming Linden into a winter wonderland. The Christmas season approached, bringing with it preparations for the school pageant and a festive mood to the town. Despite Rosalie's attempts to maintain distance, Daniel continued his gentle courtship, respectful but persistent. One evening, he arrived at her cabin with a small pine tree strapped to his horse. "Thought you might like some Christmas cheer," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Together, they set up the tree in her small sitting room, decorating it with paper chains the schoolchildren had made and a few glass ornaments Daniel had brought. The domesticity of the scene wasn't lost on Rosalie. This could be their life, these simple shared moments. When they finished, Daniel built up her fire and they sat before it, drinking hot cider. In the flickering light, his face was half in shadow, his expression thoughtful. "Christmas was Catherine's favorite time of year," he said suddenly. "She'd decorate every inch of the house, bake for weeks beforehand." Rosalie sat quietly, sensing he needed to speak. "After she died, I couldn't bear to celebrate. Packed away all the decorations, told everyone I was too busy. Did that for years." He looked at the little tree they'd decorated. "This is the first tree I've helped trim since she's been gone." The vulnerability in his admission touched her deeply. "I'm honored," she said softly. "There's something about you, Rosalie, something that makes me want to try again." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I know you're carrying something heavy. I can see it in your eyes sometimes when you think no one's watching." She stiffened, withdrawing her hand. "Daniel, you don't have to tell me, not until you're ready, maybe not ever." His eyes were earnest in the firelight. "But I want you to know that whatever it is, it wouldn't change how I feel about you." Tears threatened and Rosalie blinked them back. "You can't know that. I know enough." He reached out again slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he cupped her cheek gently. "I know you're kind and brave and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I know my days are better when I see you. And I know that if you gave me a chance, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted it." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. For a moment she leaned into his touch, allowing herself to believe. But then the familiar fear crept back, ice cold and paralyzing. "You should go," she whispered, pulling away. "Please." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. "All right, but Rosalie, I'm not giving up. Not unless you tell me there's absolutely no chance." After he left, she stood at the window, watching his tall figure disappear into the snowy night, and wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The next morning brought news that chilled Rosalie to her core. Frank Turner had been seen in Helena, asking questions about a woman matching her description. After 2 years, he'd somehow picked up her trail, Sheriff Miller came to the schoolhouse after classes, his expression grave. "Miss Turner, you should know there's a man looking for you. Says he's your husband." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "He found me," she whispered, the sheriff's eyes narrowed. "So he is your husband. He's showing up, gonna be trouble." Rosalie's hands trembled as she gathered her papers. "Sheriff, I need to leave. Today." "Now hold on," Sheriff Miller said, blocking her path. "You've been a part of this community for a year, made friends. If you're in some kind of difficulty, maybe we can help." She shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. Frank is. He's dangerous." The sheriff's expression softened. "I've been lawman long enough to recognize a woman running from a bad situation. You ain't the first, won't be the last. But running ain't always the answer." "It's the only answer," she insisted. "Maybe, maybe not." He leaned against her desk. "This man in Helena, he ain't here yet. Might not even come to Linden. But if he does, you got friends here. Me, Reverend Thomas, and I reckon Daniel Armstrong would move heaven and earth to keep you safe." At the mention of Daniel, Rosalie's resolve wavered. The thought of leaving him, of never seeing him again, caused a physical ache in her chest. "Think about it," the sheriff advised. "Don't make any hasty decisions. I'll keep an eye out, let you know if there's any sign of trouble." That night, as snow fell steadily outside her cabin, Rosalie packed her meager belongings, tears streaming down her face. She'd been foolish to stay in one place so long, foolish to begin building a life, foolish to let herself care for Daniel. A knock at her door startled her. She froze, heart pounding, until she heard Daniel's voice calling her name. When she opened the door, he stood there, snow dusting his broad shoulders, concern etched on his features. "Sheriff Miller told me," he said without preamble, "about your husband." Shame and fear washed over her. "Then you understand why I have to leave." Daniel stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. His gaze fell on her half-packed bag. "Running isn't the answer, Rosalie. It's worked for 2 years. And what kind of life is that? Always looking over your shoulder, never putting down roots." He moved closer, his eyes intense. "Let me help you." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Help me? How? Frank won't just give up. He'll come after me and anyone who stands in his way. Then we'll face him. Together, the law's on your side." She shook her head vehemently. "You don't know him. He's charming when he wants to be, makes people believe his version of events. I don't care how charming he is. I care about you." Daniel's voice was firm. "And I'm not letting you face this alone." The conviction in his tone broke something inside her. 2 years of running, of fear, of loneliness, it all came crashing down. A sob tore from her throat, and then Daniel's arms were around her, strong and secure. "It's all right," he murmured against her hair. "You're not alone anymore." She clutched at his coat, her body shaking with the force of her tears. When she could finally speak, the words tumbled out, the story of her marriage, how Frank's charming courtship had given way to jealous accusations, how the first time he hit her, she'd believed his tearful apologies, how the violence escalated until she feared for her life. Daniel listened without interruption, his arms never loosening around her. When she finished, he gently tilted her face up to his. "Thank you for trusting me with your truth. Now you understand why I have to go," she said, wiping away tears. "I won't put you or anyone else in danger." "Rosalie, leaving won't solve anything. He's found you once, he could find you again." Daniel's expression was resolute. "But here you have people who care about you, who'll stand with you." "I can't ask that of anyone." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Stay. Let us help you face this. Let me help you." The sincerity in his eyes was almost her undoing. For so long she'd carried her burdens alone, convinced that was the only way to survive. The possibility of sharing them, of not having to be strong every moment of every day, was tempting beyond words. I'm scared, she admitted. I know, but you're also brave. His smile was gentle. Brave enough to start over once. Brave enough to build a life here. Brave enough to trust me just a little. She looked up at him, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. What if he hurts you? Daniel's jaw tightened. I can take care of myself, and I promise you, Rosalie, he will never hurt you again, not while I'm breathing. The fierceness of his protection should have frightened her. It was, after all, a kind of possession. But something told her that Daniel's protectiveness came not from a desire to control, but from genuine care. He wanted her safe because he valued her, not because he considered her his property. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, for now." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Good, that's good." He took her hands in his. "We'll figure this out together, I promise." For the first time in years, Rosalie allowed herself to believe that promise might actually be kept. The following days passed in a state of tense vigilance. Daniel arranged for one of his ranch hands to stay in town, keeping watch over the schoolhouse during the day. Sheriff Miller increased his patrols, and word spread quietly among the townspeople to be alert for strangers. Despite her fears, Rosalie found comfort in the community's response. No one questioned her story, no one suggested she should return to her husband. Instead, she was met with quiet support. Mrs. Hopkins bringing extra food just because. Reverend Thomas assuring her of God's protection. Even the town's most notorious gossip, Widow Jenkins, offering her spare room. "Should you need somewhere less obvious to stay, dear." Christmas approached, bringing with it the school pageant. As Rosalie directed the children in their rehearsals, she found moments of normalcy, even joy. Daniel attended every practice, ostensibly to help build the simple scenery, but his presence was a constant reassurance. The night of the pageant, the church was filled to capacity with proud parents and community members. Rosalie stood at the back, watching her students perform the nativity story with varying degrees of success. She was so focused on making sure Tommy Miller didn't forget his lines as Joseph that she didn't immediately notice the man who slipped into the church. It was Daniel who saw him first, a well-dressed stranger standing at the opposite end of the church, his eyes scanning the crowd until they fixed on Rosalie with cold recognition. Frank Turner looked much as she remembered, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, his clothes expensive, his smile charming as he nodded politely to those around him. Only Rosalie knew the violence that lay beneath that polished exterior. Daniel was at her side instantly, his hand at the small of her back. "Is that him?" he asked quietly. She couldn't speak, could only nod, her throat tight with terror. "Stay here. I'll get the sheriff." But before Daniel could move, Frank was approaching, weaving through the crowded church with determined grace. Rosalie felt rooted to the spot, years of conditioned fear keeping her immobile. "Rosalie," Frank's voice was smooth as silk, carrying just the right note of relieved husband. "My dear wife, I've been searching everywhere for you." Several heads turned, surprised murmurs rippling through the crowd. Frank had timed his entrance perfectly, disrupting without causing a scene, ensuring witnesses to what would appear to be a touching reunion. "Frank," she managed, her voice barely audible. He reached for her hand, but Daniel stepped between them, his tall frame a physical barrier. "Evening, sir. I'm Daniel Armstrong." Frank's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Frank Turner, Rosalie's husband. I appreciate your concern for my wife during our separation, but I'm here to take her home now." Daniel didn't move. "Miss Turner seems content where she is." Frank's laugh was calculated for the benefit of those watching. "Miss Turner, I see there's been some confusion. Rosalie is Mrs. Turner, my lawfully wedded wife." He lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent nearby listeners from hearing. "I'm afraid she's been unwell. Mentally. Ran away during an episode. The doctors warned me it might happen." Rosalie felt sick as she recognized his strategy, the same one he'd used when she'd tried to get help before. Paint her as unstable, himself as the devoted husband dealing with a difficult situation. "That's not true," she said, finding her voice at last. "I left because you hurt me. Because I was afraid you would kill me." Frank's expression shifted to practiced concern. "You see what I mean? These delusions. Come, darling, let's not make a scene. I've arranged a room at the hotel. We can talk privately." "She's not going anywhere with you." Daniel's voice was steel. Sheriff Miller appeared beside them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Everything all right here?" Frank turned his charm on the lawman. "Sheriff, I'm Frank Turner. I've finally found my wife after a long search. I'd appreciate your assistance in resolving this situation." "Your wife seems reluctant," Miller observed. "As I was explaining, she's been unwell. I have documentation from her doctor in Denver." He reached into his coat, producing a folded paper. "Nervous condition. Causes paranoia delusions." Miller took the paper, scanning it with a neutral expression. Rosalie felt despair washing over her. It had been the same in Denver. Frank's money and connections, ensuring that his version of events was the one believed. But then Daniel spoke. "Sheriff, I'd like to press charges against this man for threatening Miss Turner. And I believe she may wish to file for divorce on grounds of cruelty." Frank's facade cracked slightly. "This is absurd. She's my wife." "And that doesn't give you the right to harm her," Daniel replied evenly. Sheriff Miller handed the paper back to Frank. "Mr. Turner, I suggest we continue this discussion at my office. This is hardly the place." Frank glanced around, noting the curious stares of the townsfolk, many of whom were now watching with open suspicion rather than sympathy. His calculated entrance was backfiring. "Of course," he said smoothly, "though I must insist my wife accompany us." "I'll come," Rosalie said suddenly, surprising them all. "I want to be there when you explain yourself." Daniel looked at her with concern. "You don't have to do this now." She touched his arm gently. "Yes, I do." Turning to Frank, she straightened her shoulders. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. Not here. Not with these people beside me." For a brief moment, rage flickered in Frank's eyes, that familiar look that had always preceded his worst violence. But surrounded by witnesses, he could only offer a tight smile. "As you wish, dear." At the sheriff's office, the pretense of the loving husband quickly dissolved. When Miller suggested that Rosalie might want to press charges, Frank's charm gave way to cold threat. "She has no grounds," he sneered. "She's my wife. The law gives me certain rights." "The law doesn't give you the right to beat her," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. Frank's eyes narrowed. "You've filled her head with nonsense, turned her against me. She's coming home with me where she belongs." "No," Rosalie said firmly, "I'm not." "You have no choice," Frank hissed, his mask slipping further. "You're my wife, my property. You think I won't find you again if you run? You think this Cowboy can protect you?" "I think you should watch your tone," Sheriff Miller warned. "And your accusations." Frank turned to the sheriff, his voice reasonable once more. "I apologize if I seem upset, but surely you understand my position. I've spent 2 years searching for my wife, only to find her living under false pretenses, apparently involved with another man." "I'm not your property," Rosalie said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And I want a divorce." Frank laughed harshly. "On what grounds?" "You abandoned our home. If anyone has grounds for divorce, it's me. For desertion. For adultery, perhaps." Daniel took a step forward, but Miller held up a hand, stopping him. "Mr. Turner, I'm inclined to believe Miss Rosalie's account of your marriage." and I don't take kindly to men who abuse women, wife or not." "You have no proof," Frank sneered. "I have scars," Rosalie said quietly. "All over my body, evidence of what you did to me." Frank's expression darkened. She could have gotten those anywhere from anyone. Perhaps from her cowboy lover here. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but again, Miller intervened. "That's enough. Mr. Turner, I suggest you return to your hotel and consider your options carefully. Miss Turner has established herself as a respected member of this community. Your claims about her mental state aren't likely to find much sympathy here." Frank's eyes darted between them, calculating. "This isn't over," he said finally. "She belongs to me, by law and by God." "Not anymore," Rosalie replied, finding strength in Daniel's steady presence beside her. After Frank stormed out, Sheriff Miller sighed heavily. "He's right about one thing: divorce won't be easy. Courts tend to favor husbands in these situations." "There must be something we can do," Daniel insisted. Miller scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Judge Parker will be through here next month. He's a fair man, takes a dim view of men who mistreat their wives. If we can gather evidence, testimonies about her character here in Linden versus his behavior." "I'll testify," Daniel said immediately, "and I'm sure others will too." Rosalie looked between them, overwhelmed by their support but still afraid. What if he tries something before then? "You saw him, he won't just give up." "You'll stay at the ranch," Daniel decided. "It's more defensible than your cabin, and I have men who can keep watch." "I can't impose, it's not an imposition," he interrupted gently. "Emily's still visiting. You'll have a proper chaperone. Your reputation will remain intact." Sheriff Miller nodded approvingly. "Good plan. I'll keep an eye on Turner while he's in town. If he causes trouble, I'll have grounds to run him out of Linden altogether." As they left the sheriff's office, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting in the lamplight. Daniel helped Rosalie into his wagon, tucking blankets around her for the ride to the ranch. "Are you all right?" he asked once they were underway. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I will be." She looked at his profile in the darkness. "Thank you for believing me, for standing with me." His hand found hers beneath the blankets. "Always, Rosalie, always." The days leading up to Christmas passed in a strange limbo. Rosalie stayed at the Armstrong ranch as planned, with Emily providing both companionship and the propriety of a chaperone. True to Miller's word, Frank remained in town but kept his distance, though Rosalie felt his presence like a dark cloud hovering at the edges of her newfound sanctuary. Daniel's home became her haven. Despite the circumstances, she found herself drawn into the warmth of life at the ranch, helping Emily with Christmas preparations, reading to her nieces and nephews in the evenings, sharing quiet conversations with Daniel by the fire after the others had gone to bed. On Christmas Eve, after the children had finally been persuaded to sleep despite their excitement, Daniel asked Rosalie to join him for a walk. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above them, the snow crunching beneath their feet. "I have something for you," he said, leading her to a small bench in the garden, sheltered by a wooden arbor. From his pocket, he produced a small package wrapped in silver paper. "Daniel, you shouldn't have. I wanted to." His smile was gentle in the moonlight. "Open it." Inside was a delicate silver locket, simple but beautifully crafted. When she opened it, she found a tiny pressed wildflower, the same kind he'd brought her on one of his first visits to the schoolhouse. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I know it's not much, it's perfect." She met his eyes in the darkness. "I didn't get you anything." "You're here," he said simply. "That's all I wanted." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. For a moment they sat in silence, the cold night air crystallizing their breath. "Daniel," she finally said, Even if the judge grants me a divorce, I'm not whole, I'm not undamaged. Frank took parts of me I don't know if I can ever get back. He turned to face her fully. Rosalie, do you remember what I told you about Catherine, about how losing her nearly broke me? She nodded. For years after she died, I thought I'd never feel whole again, like part of me was buried with her and our son. His voice was low, intimate in the darkness. I didn't think I deserved happiness or love, didn't think I was capable of it anymore. He took her hands in his. But then I met you, and slowly, day by day, something changed. I started to feel alive again, to hope again. His eyes held hers intently. We've both been broken, Rosalie, but maybe that's not the end of our story, maybe it's just part of it. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. I'm afraid, she confessed. Not just of Frank, but of feeling, of trusting, of believing I deserve more than fear and pain. You deserve everything good in this world. He reached up, gently brushing away her tears. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend my life showing you that. The sincerity in his words touched something deep within her, a part she'd thought long dead. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the first she'd given freely in years. When they pulled apart, Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion. "Merry Christmas, Rosalie," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Daniel," she replied. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the words felt like a promise rather than a platitude. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear. The ranch house filled with the excited voices of children discovering their gifts. The air rich with the scents of pine and cinnamon, and roasting turkey. For a few precious hours, Rosalie allowed herself to forget about Frank, about the uncertain future, and simply existed in the warmth of Daniel's family. But reality intruded harshly the following morning. One of Daniel's ranch hands rode in with news that Frank had been making inquiries around town, asking pointed questions about the Armstrong ranch, how many men worked there, how isolated it was. "He's planning something," Daniel said grimly after hearing the report. Sheriff Miller rode out that afternoon, confirming their fears. "Turner's been drinking heavily, making threats. I tried to arrest him for disturbing the peace, but he disappeared by the time I got there." "What do we do?" Emily asked, concern etched on her features. "I'm sending you and the children to Helena tomorrow," Daniel decided. "Just until this is resolved." "I should go too," Rosalie said quietly. "He wants me. If I'm not here, if you run now, he'll never stop hunting you," Daniel interrupted gently. "We end this here, one way or another." That night, after extra men had been positioned around the property and Emily had taken the children upstairs, Daniel found Rosalie standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. "You should try to sleep," he said softly. "I can't." She turned to him, her face pale in the lamplight. "This is my fault. I've brought danger to your home, to your family." "No." His voice was firm. "Frank Turner is responsible for his own actions, not you." She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, as if holding herself together. "Daniel, if anything happens to you because of me, nothing's going to happen." He moved closer, his presence reassuring. "We're prepared. Miller's bringing more men tomorrow. Frank may be desperate, but he's not stupid enough to take on a dozen armed men." But the fear wouldn't leave her. "You don't know what he's capable of. The things he's done." Daniel's expression darkened. "I can imagine, and it makes me want to." He stopped, shaking his head. "But that's not who I am. We'll handle this legally, properly. And if that's not enough, then I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The quiet intensity in his voice sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of something deeper, more primal. For the first time, she fully understood that Daniel Armstrong's gentleness was a choice, not a weakness. He moved closer, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. Rosalie, whatever happens tomorrow or the next day, know this. You are the bravest, strongest woman I've ever known. And I love you, not in spite of what you've endured, but including it, every part of you." The words hung in the air between them, both a gift and a question. Rosalie felt tears threatening again. She seemed to cry so easily around this man who had somehow slipped past all her defenses. "I don't know if I can say it back," she whispered. "Not yet, but I feel something I thought was dead in me, something I'm afraid to name." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's enough. More than enough." His kiss was gentle but held a promise of passion carefully restrained. Rosalie allowed herself to sink into it, to believe for just a moment that they might have a future beyond the shadow of Frank Turner. Dawn brought heavy clouds threatening snow, and with them, Emily's departure. Rosalie hugged the children tightly, trying to hide her fear that she might never see them again. "This isn't goodbye," Emily whispered fiercely as they embraced. "We'll be back for New Year's, and you'll be here, and this will all be over." By mid-morning, Sheriff Miller arrived with 3 deputies. "No sign of Turner," he reported, "but his things are gone from the hotel. He's out there somewhere." Daniel nodded grimly. "We're ready." The day passed in tense vigilance. Rosalie moved restlessly through the house, unable to settle, jumping at every sound. By evening, when no attack had materialized, a fragile hope began to form. Perhaps Frank had given up, moved on to easier prey. But as darkness fell, one of the ranch hands spotted movement at the edge of the property. Daniel immediately organized his men, positioning them strategically around the house. "Stay inside," he told Rosalie firmly. "Lock the doors behind me." "Daniel," she began, fear clutching at her heart. He kissed her quickly. "It'll be all right. Trust me." As she watched from the window, Daniel and Sheriff Miller moved cautiously toward the barn where the movement had been spotted. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, flames erupted from the far side of the structure, quickly engulfing the dry wood. "Fire!" Rosalie cried, rushing to the door despite Daniel's instructions. The ranch hands scrambled to form a bucket line from the well, but the blaze spread rapidly. In the chaos and smoke, Rosalie didn't see the figure approaching from behind the house until a hand clamped roughly over her mouth. "Hello, wife," Frank hissed in her ear, dragging her backward. "Miss me?" Terror paralyzed her as he pulled her away from the light and commotion, toward the shadows of the trees. The knife at her throat was cold against her skin. "You thought you could escape me," he growled, his breath hot and whiskey soured. "Thought you could start a new life with your cowboy lover." "Frank, please," she managed when he loosened his grip slightly. "Shut up," he jerked her roughly. "You're mine. Till death do us part, remember, and if I can't have you, no one will." The familiar threat, spoken so many times during their marriage, sparked something unexpected in Rosalie, not fear, but anger. 2 years of running, of hiding, of rebuilding herself piece by painful piece, and here he was again, trying to reduce her to property, to nothing. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I never really was." His grip tightened painfully. "You ungrateful bitch. After everything I gave you, pain," she interrupted. "Fear, scars. Is that what you think a husband gives his wife?" He laughed harshly. "You needed discipline. Still do, apparently." As he dragged her further from the house, Rosalie knew she had to act. This might be her only chance. With every ounce of strength she possessed, she slammed her elbow backward into his ribs. Frank grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to twist away. But he recovered quickly, lunging for her. The knife slashed across her arm as she stumbled backward. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, advancing on her. Rosalie backed away, clutching her bleeding arm. "Help!" she screamed. "Daniel, help me!" Frank's face twisted with rage. "Your cowboy can't save you. The fire will keep them busy long enough." He lunged again, but this time Rosalie was ready. She ducked under his arm and ran, heart pounding, toward the light of the burning barn. Behind her, she could hear Frank's heavy footsteps, his labored breathing. "Daniel!" she cried again, her voice carrying across the open space. And then he was there, appearing suddenly through the smoke, his expression transforming from concern to fury as he took in the scene, Rosalie bleeding, Frank pursuing her with a knife. "Get away from her," Daniel growled, stepping between them. Frank stopped, knife held ready. "This doesn't concern you, Armstrong. She's my wife." "Not for much longer." Daniel's voice was ice. "Put down the knife, Turner," Frank laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed man. What would the law say about that?" "I'd say he'd be within his rights," came Sheriff Miller's voice as he emerged from the smoke, gun drawn. "Drop it, Turner. It's over." For a moment, Frank seemed to consider his options, his eyes darting between them. Then, with a howl of rage, he charged at Daniel, knife raised. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Daniel sidestepped the attack, catching Frank's wrist and twisting until the knife fell to the snow. But Frank fought like a cornered animal, his strength fueled by rage and desperation. They grappled, falling to the ground, rolling dangerously close to the burning barn. Sheriff Miller tried to get a clear shot, but the men were too entangled. Rosalie watched in horror as Frank managed to get his hands around Daniel's throat, pressing with murderous intent. Without thinking, she grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all her might at Frank's head. The impact sent him sprawling, momentarily stunned. Daniel rolled away, gasping for breath. Frank struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his temple. His eyes found Rosalie's, filled with a hatred so pure it chilled her to her soul. "You're dead," he whispered, reaching for the dropped knife. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the winter air. Frank staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest. Then he crumpled to the snow. Sheriff Miller lowered his smoking gun. "He didn't leave me a choice," he said grimly. Rosalie stood frozen, staring at the body of the man who had terrorized her for so long. She felt nothing. No grief, no relief, no triumph. Just a strange, hollow emptiness. Then Daniel was beside her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders, gently turning her away from the sight. "It's over," he murmured. "He can't hurt you anymore." As his words penetrated the fog surrounding her mind, Rosalie began to shake, delayed shock setting in. Daniel gathered her carefully in his arms, mindful of her wounded arm, and carried her back to the house. The following days passed in a blur. The town doctor treated her arm, assuring her it would heal with minimal scarring. Sheriff Miller took statements from everyone involved, concluding officially that Frank Turner had died while attempting to commit murder, the shooting deemed justifiable. Rosalie moved through these practicalities as if in a dream, responding when spoken to, doing what was asked of her, but feeling strangely disconnected from it all. It wasn't until 3 days after Frank's death, as she stood at his hastily dug grave on the outskirts of the town cemetery, that the reality truly hit her. He was gone. Really gone. The nightmare was over. Daniel stood beside her, silent but supportive, allowing her the space to process her complicated emotions. "I should feel something," she finally said. "Grief, maybe. He was my husband, or relief at least." "You feel what you feel," Daniel replied simply. "There's no right way to respond to this." She looked at the plain wooden marker bearing Frank's name and dates. "I thought I'd be free when he was gone, but I don't feel free. I feel tainted, like he left his mark on me forever." That evening, as they sat before the fire in Daniel's study, Rosalie finally allowed the tears to come, not for Frank, but for the young woman she had been, for the innocence lost, for the years stolen from her. Daniel held her through it all, steady and patient, until the storm passed and she lay exhausted against his chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm such a mess." "No," he said firmly, tilting her face up to his. "You're healing. There's a difference." His understanding unlocked something within her, a truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "I want to show you something, but I'm afraid." "Whatever it is, you can trust me." Slowly, with trembling fingers, she began to unbutton the high collar of her dress. Daniel watched her with questioning eyes but didn't stop her. When she pulled the fabric down to reveal her shoulder and upper chest, he inhaled sharply. A network of scars crisscrossed her pale skin, some thin and white with age, others newer, still pink and raised. Evidence of Frank's cruelty, of her suffering, permanently etched into her flesh. "This is why I can't." Her voice broke. "How could anyone love this? I'm too scarred to be loved." For a long moment, Daniel simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with infinite tenderness, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to the largest scar, a jagged line that ran across her collarbone. "Perfect," he whispered against her skin. Tears filled her eyes again as he moved to the next scar and the next, kissing each mark with reverence. "Daniel, perfect," he repeated, his voice husky with emotion. "Every inch of you. These scars don't make you less lovable, Rosalie. They're proof of your strength, your survival." She closed her eyes as his lips traced the map of her pain, transforming it somehow into something else, not beautiful, perhaps, but sacred. Testimony to a past she had endured, not a future she was condemned to. "I love you," she whispered, the words finally finding their way past the barriers of fear. "I love you, Daniel Armstrong." His answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "And I love you, Rosalie Turner, all of you." In his eyes, she saw no pity, no disgust, only acceptance and a love so profound it took her breath away. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly believe that her scars, both those visible on her skin and the deeper ones etched into her soul, did not make her unworthy of love. They made her a survivor. Spring came to Montana in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Judge Parker, true to Sheriff Miller's prediction, proved sympathetic to Rosalie's situation. Given the circumstances of Frank's death and the testimonies of respected community members regarding his character and behavior, the judge granted Rosalie a declaration that her marriage had ended with Frank's death, clearing any legal complications regarding her status or property claims. On a perfect May afternoon, with apple blossoms drifting on the breeze, Rosalie Turner married Daniel Armstrong beneath an arbor in his garden, the same spot where he had given her the silver locket on Christmas Eve. Emily stood as her witness, Sheriff Miller as Daniel's, while the children scattered flower petals and the entire town of Linden gathered to celebrate. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Thomas concluded with a smile. As Daniel's lips met hers, gentle yet filled with promise, Rosalie felt the last shadows of her past receding. Not gone entirely, they would always be part of her story, but no longer defining her future. That night, as they stood together on the porch of what was now their home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Daniel's arms wrapped securely around her waist. "Happy?" he asked softly. Rosalie leaned back against his solid strength, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "Yes," she answered truthfully. "For the first time in so long, I'm not afraid of tomorrow." "Good." He pressed a kiss to her temple, "because we have many tomorrows ahead of us." She turned in his embrace, reaching up to trace the beloved lines of his face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, all of me. Always, he promised, the word both a vow and a blessing. As they stood together beneath the endless sky, Rosalie knew with absolute certainty that her scars, both visible and invisible, were not the end of her story, but merely a chapter in it. A chapter that had led her, against all odds, to this place, this man, this love. And for that, she could finally be grateful. 5 years later, Rosalie sat on the same porch, watching Daniel teaching their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony in the corral. Beside her, their baby daughter, Catherine, slept peacefully in her cradle, her tiny hand clutching the silver locket that now contained miniature portraits of both children. The Armstrong ranch had prospered under their joint care, becoming known throughout the territory for its hospitality as much as its fine horses. Rosalie still taught at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, having helped establish a proper school building to replace the old one-room structure. The little library she and Daniel had dreamed of now occupied a corner of the town hall, growing steadily with each passing year. As she watched her husband lift their squealing son from the pony, his laughter carrying across the yard, Rosalie felt a familiar warmth bloom in her chest. Not the desperate, consuming passion she had once mistaken for love in her youth, but something deeper, steadier, a love built on mutual respect, understanding, and the daily choice to see and honor each other's truths. The scars on her body had faded with time, though they would never disappear completely. The scars on her heart had healed differently, not vanishing but transforming, becoming part of the strong, resilient woman she now knew herself to be. Perfect, Daniel still called her in quiet moments when his fingers traced the silvery lines on her skin. Perfect not because she was flawless, but because she was fully, authentically herself, past, present, and future woven together into a life that was, against all odds, beautiful. As if feeling her gaze, Daniel looked up and smiled, that same smile that had first begun to melt the ice around her heart years ago. Rosalie smiled back, unguarded and true, grateful beyond words for the man who had shown her that her scars were not the end of her story. They were merely the beginning.